The surprise resignation of Lebanese Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri presents a very high risk of setting in motion events that may start with political and may end up with armed conflict in Lebanon. The resignation is almost certainly the result of Saudi pressure, regardless of whether Hariri himself wished to resign or not. This is the opening shot in what could become an open military conflict in Lebanon, possibly involving the Israelis, and possibly, once they become involved, other elements within Lebanon that seek to isolate Hezbollah and then move against it. I think we'll get a better sense of where things are heading in Lebanon within the next 1 to 3 weeks, as the American administration and Congress debate new sanctions on Iran. We'll see whether these sanctions extend against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and also if they extend beyond Hezbollah to other Lebanese entities and individuals in Lebanon. That could then signal preparation for a wider showdown, because of course there will be political polarization inside Lebanon. Hezbollah itself and Iran behind it may start to counter-mobilize and prepare their responses to where they think events are going. And so we could end up in a situation where Israel finally has a pretext for launching wide-scale military action in Lebanon, which is something it has been signaling for quite a while, and which it recently has been underlining far more emphatically in both private and public. Saudi Arabia has somewhat limited options for escalation against Iran in the region, because its main tools for such an escalation are indirect. It can attack those it sees as Iran's allies or proxies, and this is what it has done in Yemen by launching a war 2.5 years ago against the Houthi rebels and their allies, the former President Ali Abdullah Saleh. Picking a fight, as it seems, in Lebanon with Iran's ally Hezbollah is another indirect means of confronting Iran. Of course, in the past, Saudi Arabia has invested a great deal in its attempt to bring down Syrian President Bashar al-Assad through supporting the Syrian opposition, also as a means of eliminating an important strategic ally of Iran in the region. The problem for Saudi Arabia, of course, is all these are negative measures, i.e. they are measures that involve it in confrontation, that undermine its own alliances and relationships in the region. There's a risk that by, for instance, attacking Yemen, it has now devastated a country that is on its borders, and that will remain an open source of political problems, of migration, of refugees, and of security threats in the future, to an extent that may exceed the threat it posed in the past. Equally, destabilizing Lebanon may not be the goal, but if that is the consequence of its actions now in Lebanon, then also it may push Lebanon even further towards Iran, or ultimately end up weakening its own allies inside Lebanon if they lose the coming political or military battle there. So the options for Saudi Arabia are all negative. In the past, of course, it has used its manipulation of oil production to bring down or raise oil prices as a means of pressuring the Iranian economy. That right now is not a feasible option, because Saudi Arabia needs every penny it can get from oil revenue, from oil exports. And so the option of cutting production, is not good for Saudi Arabia any more than it is for Iran. So if Saudi Arabia wished to develop far more effective options, then I think those would have to be a thorough rethink of its approach. In other words, it has to work out ways of dealing with Iran, which obviously is a problematic country or a problematic government. Saudi Arabia does have good reason to be unhappy with the Iranian policy on many different levels. However, Iran will always be there. And Saudi Arabia, which already has had a history of 50 or 60 years of problematic ties with Iran, whether under the Shah or whether under the Islamic Republic, Saudi Arabia needs to work out different kinds of methods for dealing with Iran. It needs to have maybe a formal dialogue mechanism, whether it's bilateral or regional involving other Gulf countries. It needs to develop something that provides a forum to discuss differences and ways of working out these differences when they affect other countries such as Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, or Yemen, or bilateral issues to do with security, with the nuclear issue, or with oil prices. It won't be easy, but this is not something the Saudis have ever really committed to in the past, and it's about time they tried it. The crisis that is about to unfold in Lebanon will likely have a significant impact on developments in Syria. The war in Syria, until days ago, looked like it would be heading towards some sort of decisive ending, maybe over another 1 or 2 years, but one which sees the president Bashar al-Assad remain in power and sees his government regain control over most of the territory, with the exception of parts of the Syrian territories held by the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. And I think that the dialogue and eventually formal negotiations, whether secret or not, between the Kurds and the Syrian government we're going to be we're going to unfold. Now, the problem is that if Lebanon heads into a real crisis in which there is the prospect of military conflict involving Israel, possibly involving other Lebanese actors against each other inside Lebanon, this may draw Iran into protecting its interests and its stake in Lebanon and in Syria more aggressively. This could mean some form of military deployment. We have yet to see whether Russia will try to intervene diplomatically, at least, with Israel on the one side, with the US on the other, to establish what they regard as a red line for any sort of outside military action in Lebanon, or any support for local actors in Lebanon to undertake military action. So, in other words, we're entering into a situation in Lebanon which is very difficult to predict, in which multiple actors may become involved and start to compete with each other and escalate against each other to deter their action. In that situation, the dialogue inside Syria, which mainly now involves Turkey, Russia, the regime, and the Kurds, is likely to be delayed while these various actors work out how they want to stand on Lebanon, whether their alliances with the US on the one side, with Russia on the other side, potentially with Iran, how these relationships will play out in relation to Lebanon, and how that affects their calculations and interests in Syria. So we may have a significant knock-on effect for Syria that may extend the presence, for instance, of Turkish forces inside Syria beyond what might have been likely. That might involve the Russians in further escalation there in order to defeat American influence in the north and the east as a retaliation for what happens next in Lebanon. So unfortunately, escalation in Lebanon will probably mean a prolongation of the conflict in Syria.